Hello, everyone, and welcome to another grand reckoning. We have your hosts, Daniel, which is me, and Shaiel. We also have a gentleman who runs the West Africa Weekly. David, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what the goals and reason for West Africa Weekly is.
Okay, so my name is David Hundeyin. I started off as I've been many things. I've worn many hats, but over the past 6, 7 years, I moved away from broadcast media and entertainment, which is kind of the space I was in at the time, and I moved into sort of serious journalism. So I used to work in TV, and I segued into investigative journalism, print. Well, I'm not sure you can call it print because it wasn't in physical print, but I moved from visual to written. That was around 2018. In 2021 was when I set up West Africa Weekly because what I noticed was that there wasn't really any publication that was centered on that part of the world. Like it seems like every region of the world has its own sort of region specific media that touches on like its core like geopolitical and serious issues within it, except West Africa. We just have like national media and everything is really fractured. And I thought, hey, I traveled around West Africa a lot, especially when I was a kid. I'm very familiar with the region. I know people around the region. So why don't I sort of try and aggregate this? So that's how it started off. It actually started off as a Substack newsletter. And then in 2023, it sort of transitioned into like a full-fledged platform in its own right. And that's kind of where we are. So, what West Africa Weekly basically is, I try not to put it into pigeonholes because media very easily gets pigeonholed. But generally speaking, what I'm happy to describe West Africa Weekly as is a publication that tells the story of the world through West African eyes. So its focus, its core focus is West Africa. Its core audience is pri- primarily millennial and Gen Z West African populations, Anglophone. Unfortunately, we don't really have that much. We don't really have that many French people on French speaking staff members yet. Hopefully, that will change because that like there's a good half of West Africa, more than half of West Africa that is native French speaking. So that's kind of a problem since we're Anglophone. But it's a problem that we're working on. And in terms of our politics, you could describe us. I hate using the left-right dichotomy because I think that's a Western phenomenon. But you could describe us as a West African sovereignist. You could describe us as anti-imperialist. Yeah, I think that would be fair.
Spoken to numerous what they call themselves Pan-Africanists. Is that close to what we're talking about here?
Yes, it is. But again, it's one of those pigeonholes that I try to
Yeah.
avoid mention because that term is a very historically loaded term and it comes with a lot of baggage. But yes, it would not be inaccurate to describe us as Pan African.
But we're very sympathetic to the idea of not pigeonhole anyone into any
Very, yeah.
idea because so a little bit about what we do. We're very anti-conflict, anti-war, pro-solving conflicts. We feel that a lot of the social media today, YouTubers today, take very strong stands in favor of one side, one issue, to the point where it actually feeds conflict, where it actually feeds strife. And what we want to do here is figure out how to lower the flames, how to take those kind of conflicting identities and sort of demilitarize them and work towards solutions. So that's why we're completely sympathetic to what you're saying, where you don't want to be pigeonholed as left or right, and you don't want to be pigeonholed as Pan-African. What we want to promote here is solutions that are good for human beings generally. Speaking of pigeonholes that we don't want to do for ourselves, probably something like humanism,
Right, right.
something like that.
It's not a bad pigeonhole to put ourselves in because,
It's
like I
not a
said,
bad pitch.
our kind of goal is also to highlight, the bright spots of what's going on. There are people like yourself that see the world and go, "Hey, this isn't okay." We see both the rage and like this despair. One of your followers that I've started looking at, she was sharing something about in Tigray, they were handing out skateboards. And I'm telling you, like, I was like eyes watering watching these kids just playing on a skateboard, and it meant so much to me because it's like this is what children should be doing, kicking
Yeah.
around a soccer ball, playing on skateboards. Like this is what they should be doing. And that to me is what's beautiful. The reason we brought you today is Sudan is a conflict that is just heavily ignored. It seems like even when I go to look into the conflict itself and other people speaking on it, it's always like blended in as if it's not its own conflict, if that makes sense. Now I
Yeah.
understand that anything anything that happens has other actors, but like I said, to get away from playing a rooting for any side, I think Sudan is a really good example because it's pretty obvious that the SAF and the RSF are not the quote unquote good guys from any standpoint.
Yeah.
So if you could give a really quick overview of exactly what got us to where we are today.
Right. So Sudan it's a uniquely unfortunate story, even by African standards, because there are lots of moving parts in the story. I like the fact that you said there are no good guys, and it's not a simple story. There are loads of simple stories that come together and create this mess, this soup, right? Which is what we're dealing with right now. So I'll try and sort of lay them out in sequence. So you'd have to go back to maybe the 60s and the 70s to sort of track the genesis of where all of this starts from. So during that time period, that was when there was the Pan-Africanist movement and there was the Pan-Arabist movement. And as I'm sure you know, North Africa is sort of like a junction point of the two. North Africa is where it's like do they consider themselves African first or do they consider themselves Arab first? That's a never ending question and a never ending topic of debate. So you had leaders like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who, just to be clear about this, was responsible for a lot of good things on the African continent, but was also responsible, whether deliberately or inadvertently, for a lot of these complications, including some of the things that led to the Sudan conflict. So he was at one point projecting as a Pan-Africanist, and he made he didn't just say things; he put his money where his mouth was. So he did a lot of good things. So, for example, part of the reason why in West Africa, or at least in Nigeria, we were able to get some mobile telecoms when we did was because it was directly linked to an investment, a sovereign investment made by Gaddafi's Libya, right? There were lots of good things on the continent when he projected as Pan-African. But before he entered his Pan-African era, when he was in his Pan-Arabist era, he tried to do similar things in the Arab world. It didn't work. And unfortunately, that created complications. One of those complications was that in countries like Libya and Sudan, there increasingly became this there increasingly became the prevalence of this schism between the parts of the population that consider themselves to be Black African and then the parts of the population that consider themselves to be Arab. Sudan, in particular, is a very weird example of this schism because a lot of the people who self identify as Arab in Sudan, including many of the people who later go on to commit these genocides, if you look at them, you can see very clearly like this person is darker than me, right? So you can see very, very clearly you are very, very much a sub Saharan African, but they self identify as Arab, they only speak Arabic. They're culturally Arab and will go to incredible extents to including the use of violence to their Arabness because they define their Arabness almost like as something that was in conflict with with being African, right? I personally don't think that there needs to be a conflict between being African and being Arab. I think you can be both. But the pan Arabism that existed at that time was an ideology that didn't really have much room for that kind of nuance. So, one of the consequences of the actions of people like Gaddafi was that in trying to push this pan Arabist movement at the time, this dangerous idea started taking root across North Africa that aligning themselves with their Arab brethren and aligning themselves politically to achieve certain geopolitical goals as an Arab unit meant becoming culturally and politically homogenous. So if you're a country like Sudan or Libya or Algeria or Mauritania, which obviously had mixed populations, then that became a problem. And the problem was amplified by the fact that in all these countries I mentioned, the Arab or the Arab identifying populations were the ones holding political power. So that was the genesis of the genocides, because there wasn't just one genocide. There were several genocides across North Africa. The one in Sudan gets the most airplay, obviously, but there were multiple. That was where sort of this issue began. Now, as is so often the case, where there's a conflict point or flashpoint anywhere on the planet, you get geopolitical actors who spot an opportunity to do something and they jump in. And if the tensions are currently at 2 out of 10, they jump in and ratchet it up to 6 out of 10. So if this was I mean, there's no such thing as a less serious genocide. Let's use the term low intensity genocide, right? If this was a low intensity genocide where 200 people a month are getting killed, then that number goes up to 2,000. And that's what started happening because some people saw an opportunity then. I think so. Coming back to Sudan, a guy who was kind of central to this, his name was Omar al-Bashir. He was the former president of Sudan. He was, I think, the biggest villain in this entire story because he was the one who turned it into official government policy to Arabize Sudan. And by Arabize, I mean like it became official government policy that anyone who didn't identify as Arab and Muslim shouldn't be Sudanese or shouldn't be considered to be Sudanese. And bear in mind, this was a country that had more than half of the country, at one time didn't necessarily identify as Muslim. There were Christians, there were African traditional religion adherents, there were all kinds of people. Sudan was a very diverse country. And then this guy comes and says, everyone must be Arab or Berber Muslim.
What did it mean
And
to
to
be
end,
Sudanese before Omar al-Bashir? So how did the groups come together and what was Sudanese identity like before that policy?
so
Like
first of all, I
what
should
solidified the idea of independence itself when you first gained independence?
So I think that's actually where I should have started this story from, because the country now known as Sudan is, by the way, a completely different place to the ancient civilization known as Sudan, even though they share some geographical similarities. So essentially, what we have now, Sudan, and I'm including both North Sudan and South Sudan, that was a British creation. So the British basically went to this part of North Africa, and as they did in many other places around the world, just drew lines in the sand and said, "This is Sudan." Right? There
It
was no
worked out
such
great everywhere they did it.
exactly. So there really was no such national entity. They just created it. Now, in a place like Nigeria, where they did something similar, even though there's a lot of diversity in Nigeria, everyone in Nigeria identifies as Black African. Literally everyone. So even though there has been a civil war in Nigeria, it's not to the extent of things like what happened in Sudan. Now, Sudan, on the other hand, the British basically just obviously in the hunt for resources or whatever, looking for the largest possible territory, and just drew a really huge circle, basically. The national borders of Sudan don't really make sense. Most African borders don't really make sense because they weren't drawn by Africans, and that's pretty much. So when Sudan gained independence, as with so many other sub-Saharan African countries, it became the case that the ethnic group that happened to be in power at the point where independence was given to them started seeing it as almost like their duty to ensure that they maintain and solidify power so that they can dominate the new country that they've been given. So they weren't necessarily seeing their country from a nationalist point of view. They were seeing it almost from like an imperial point of view. So they weren't seeing it as we are trying to build a country. They were seeing it as we are trying to dominate this area. So you can, I forget who it was that made the joke that all problems go back to the British. You know, I wish it was a joke. It seems to be quite an accurate comment.
Well, I mean, I think you pointed out earlier when you were talking about like the different geopolitical actors funding different sides of this conflict. I think me and Shaiel have actually talked about this before about how even the American Revolution was a proxy war with the Britain and France. So anytime there's a conflict, geopolitical actors really do take advantage and ratchet that pain up so that way they can play their little war without fighting their people. I mean, we see from our own leaders in America how when you're talking about Russia and Ukraine, you got Lindsey Graham saying it's great. Russians are dying and there's no American troops. It's like, well, there's pregnant Ukrainian women on the front line right now, so I don't think that's great. So
Which, unfortunately, is how, I mean,
I know you'll
that's
agree with me. You're also a Russian propagandist, according to.
Kremlin-backed things, you know. I'm also a Chinese agent, just thought I'd throw that out there.
They got their roots deep.
Yeah. Part-time Iranian and North Korean as well. So
I'm owned by
get
Qatar.
around.
I get told a lot.
Fantastic.
Told him
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm trying
yeah.
to get.
So, long story short, Omar al-Bashir turns it into state policy to basically Arabize Sudan, and that's where the Sudanese genocides begin. Now, the most significant and the most dangerous action that he took, which you can directly trace to this conflict ongoing right now, is that he created a new national militia. So there was the Sudanese Armed Forces. So then he created something called the Janjaweed militia, and their job was basically to act outside of the parameters of a state entity and basically to do the dirty work that he didn't want the Sudanese army to be associated with, i.e.,
Plausible
genocide.
deniability.
Exactly. So basically go around killing a bunch of black people, which is what they did for the longest time. So you've heard of Darfur, that's basically what was going on there, and what is now South Sudan. That was going on for the longest time. So at the time, because I was a child when all of this was happening, at the time, just following the events from across the continent, it seemed like a very straightforward story to me that there are Arab aggressors, there are Black African victims, and it's that simple. So in 2011, when the referendum took place and South Sudan became an independent country, I was really happy for them. It seemed like such a cut and dried, simple, easy narrative. Until, of course, I got older, and then I realized that, first of all, the referendum that took place was essentially an American project, like 100%, right? Without US involvement,
Wesley Clark.
yeah, without US involvement, there will probably still be a genocide going on right now because nobody cared. That thing would have continued forever. It was the US government that specifically set out to partition Sudan, not to rescue South Sudan, but to partition Sudan. And the reason for partitioning Sudan was because of a wider geopolitical play involving Israel, essentially, because Sudan had been marked as one of the 7 countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, which, for whatever reason, Benjamin Netanyahu considered to be a threat and needed to be neutralized. So the interesting thing, if you look at the map of Sudan and South Sudan now, the major source of government revenue, which fed the Sudanese government, which was oil, it's almost entirely located in South Sudan. Now, the way the lines were drawn were such that all the oil wells fall within South Sudan. So essentially, by making South Sudan an independent country, the Sudanese government has been completely defanged and has been neutralized as a strategic threat to Benjamin Netanyahu. So that's what was going on. Obviously, we didn't know any of that. All that we saw was a simple and easy narrative. Something else I found out when I got into journalism, and then when similar issues started happening, or what looked like similar issues started happening in Nigeria, and then I was part of a documentation project in 2019 that was going around documenting like these cases of genocidal violence in Nigeria. And one of the people I was working with on the project is a guy called Dr. Richard Ikebe. He works with an NGO called the International Committee on Nigeria and another one called the International Project for Peace Building and Social Justice. It's based in the UK. He told me something very interesting, and he said part of the reason why he was pursuing this project was that he was trying to get the US special envoy appointed to Nigeria. And I said, why? And he said that basically what made South Sudan independent, what made the referendum possible, was that the US appointed a special envoy to Sudan specifically on that issue. So at the time, I didn't understand the significance of this when I was hearing it, but obviously as years go by, you sort of piece these pieces of information together. And what I came to realize was that so the genocide might have started off on its own, but the US government spotted an opportunity in that conflict and sort of, as they do, sort of jumped in and made something bigger out of it. I'm not accusing the US government of fueling the genocide, but they definitely were behind the decision to partition Sudan. And in fact, if you listened to Dr. Jeffrey Sachs speak about this issue, he reveals actually that they basically set up shop in Nairobi, which is like next door to Sudan, for years. They were basically stage managing this entire operation to balkanize the country. So anyway, going back to what I was saying about the Janjaweed militia. So in the wake of South Sudan becoming independent and the Janjaweed basically having no reason to exist any longer, but bear in mind they were still very heavily armed, resourced, and that they're not just going to go home after spending 20 years killing people, right? So the original plan was that they were supposed to get integrated into the Sudanese armed forces, into the military. As we know in hindsight now, that was never going to happen. At some point, I think it's fair to say that the Janjaweed militia then, which was then rebranded as the Rapid Support Forces, I think it's fair to say, were actually more heavily armed than the Sudanese military, and they were also much more battle hardened because they had been fighting nonstop for decades. So that's where you first saw this split in the sort of military power structure of Sudan, where on the one hand you have the official armed forces with what's his name, General, I forget his name, and then on the other hand you have the Rapid Support Forces led by Hamdan, or what I also forget
Yeah,
his name.
Hamedi, I think it is. Yeah,
Yeah, Hemeti.
I always
Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti against
Hemeti.
Abdel Fattah el Burhan.
Al Burhan, yes,
yes.
that's the Sudanese armed forces head.
This is why we need the guy that can say all the names.
Yeah, I'm an ethnic Sudanese. Everyone knows that. But I have a passing familiarity with Arabic, so I can almost pronounce it. Yeah.
That's really what it is. But when we look at the coup for Bashir, my conspiracy theory mind looks at that and wonders whether there was ever any intention from Hamedi or what was the other gentleman again?
Burhan, Al Burhan.
Borhan. Yeah, if there was ever any intentionality for a civilian government in the first place, and whether or not this was kind of a way to avoid that in the first place, that kind of just spiraled out of both of their control.
I don't think there was ever any chance really of a stable civilian government. It was just not possible. So, the coup was basically inevitable, and basically as soon as the all the oil resources were partitioned into South Sudan, it was kind of inevitable that Sudan had been set up to fail. It's almost inevitable at that point, and that's exactly what happened. So, um, what then, I guess, took center stage, which for whatever reason has still not percolated into the mainstream narrative surrounding this war, is that apart from oil, Sudan also happens to be a major source of solid minerals like gold, right? And for whatever reason, the gold producing territory of Sudan happened to fall under the control of what is now the Rapid Support Forces, right? So basically, these guys were able to fund their own parallel military operation. They were able to arm themselves and become, to an extent, more powerful than the Sudanese military. So when the Sudanese military finally cracked the whip and said, right, in the next 2 years, they set a 2 year deadline that we're going to reintegrate, we're going to integrate you into the Sudanese army. There's going to be no rapid support forces anymore. We can't run a country with two militaries. This makes no sense. And then the counter offer that came from the Rapid Support Forces was that instead of 2 years, let's make it 10 years, which is as good as saying, hell no, So at that point, it was almost inevitable what was going to happen. And what is more interesting is that the gold that is trafficked out of Sudan, and this is acknowledged even officially, that almost 100% of the gold trafficked out of Sudan goes to the UAE, Dubai specifically. Dubai is very, very well recognized as the sort of global hub for trafficked conflict minerals, especially gold. So it's very interesting that the geopolitical player in the region that is most widely recognized for siding with the Rapid Support Forces has been the UAE. Right, there have been several investigations done about this where it's been what's it called, military transport planes that belong to the UAE have been spotted in Chad, which is next door, is to the east of Sudan in the territory occupied by the RSF. And it's been what's the word now? It's been this happens to me once in a while where like the word for something in English just completely escapes me, and I'm thinking of the word, but it's in another language. But you're not going to understand what I'm saying. It's been determined that the largest supporter, the largest military supplier of the RSF, has actually been the UAE, to the point where these guys have actually gained access to armed drones, and they've actually been carrying out drone attacks in places like Port Sudan. And this is on the direct tab of the UAE. So I think it's very interesting that the country that is the beneficiary of the wealth that is being hemorrhaged by Sudan while it remains in this state is the country that is pumping more and more of these military resources in, not necessarily with the intention of winning and pushing out the Sudanese armed forces, which I don't think is a realistic goal, but essentially just to keep the conflict going and to maintain the situation as it is, because they seem to benefit very much from the status quo. While Sudan is in this parlous state, the UAE is, I guess, the biggest beneficiary of all of this. So that's why I said there are a lot of moving parts in this story. There's a element in this story as well. There's potentially a Saudi and Qatari element in this story as well. There are lots of moving parts in this story, but primarily from an African point of view, I think I would have to say it's a story that essentially is born out of the tragedy of this widespread identity crisis, which again is a direct consequence of two colonizations. So
Yeah.
before the British.
To me, there's two stories here that I don't see how they interconnect. I'm saying this out of ignorance, not criticism of what you're saying. One story is the ethnic story, and the other story is the economic story. So we have ethnic grievances; those are a classic spur of civil war. And we have resources, and those are a classic spur of civil war. And the way it was framed in the Western media, at least, the previous conflict, Darfur, South Sudan, those were ethnic conflicts, and this is a resource conflict. That's what I'm seeing. And even when I ask
Yeah,
people what's the RSF's political grievance, it's not clear what
they
that they
can't
have.
find one. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so how do those two things intersect? What is the relationship between the ethnic conflict element in Sudan and the resource element in Sudan?
So because the RSF started off as essentially an ethnic militia made up of religious extremists, um, their I guess their what's the word I'm looking for now? Their origin lies in ethnic cleansing. Now, even now, as they've rebranded from Janjaweed into RSF, if you check some of the records of the atrocities that they've been responsible for over the past 2 to 3 years, you still see that the things they do are very, very reminiscent of the things they used to do in Darfur. So they're still targeting villages primarily populated by people who don't identify as Arab or Muslim, and they're still carrying out those mass atrocities like mass rapes and poisoning people and floggings and torture and castrating people, all those nasty things they used to do in the 90s and noughties. They are still doing those things. However, now, as you rightly said, it doesn't seem as if there's necessarily any um, uh, coherent strategy, like a coherent political goal. At that time, there was a coherent political goal, which was ethnic replacement using violence. Now, that's no longer a realistic position that's on the table, but they're still deploying those tactics because I guess that's what they're familiar with. They were trained on that. So it's essentially, from as far as I can tell, because obviously I haven't spent time in Sudan, so I'm saying this as someone who is looking as an outsider and as someone who has spoken to people who are involved in the conflict. As far as I can tell, which again ties in with the UAE's role in all of this, the goal of the RSF is not to win, because they are not going to win this war. It's fundamentally just not a realistic thing to do. The only time there was a realistic chance of the RSF actually winning this war was when there was a siege against the top command of the Sudanese military in Khartoum. As soon as that siege was broken, and as soon as Sudan was able to rally its support from its international partners, because don't forget, the Sudanese armed forces, whether you like it or not, is still recognized by the UN as the legitimate government of the country. And as a legitimate government of the country, they're able to rally support in ways that a militia cannot, regardless of how much funding it gets from the UAE. So these guys are not going to defeat the Sudanese armed forces. They're not going to retake the areas that they've been pushed out of. They're not. But as far as I can tell, the goal is just to keep this going for as long as possible. And in almost I don't want to use the comparison with Ukraine, but you know how it's often said that some people are going to fight to the last man. That's kind of like how I see what the RSF is trying to do here. The people who are behind it just need this to go on for as long as possible. So every time it looks like there's been a conventional breakthrough that would meaningfully end the war in almost any other circumstance. So, for example, where Sudan's second largest city, Omdurman, was liberated by Sudanese armed forces. So basically, you had the capital and the second largest city both under official government control. At that point, you'd have thought that that's curtains. That's it. It's done. Realistically, you're not retaking any of those places. You're being pushed out. That should have been the end of the RSF. But instead, they regrouped and congregated around Port Sudan and then started carrying out this incredibly violent, incredibly angry attack on Port Sudan, primarily against civilians. So as far as I can tell, there's no real intention to win this as a conventional military conflict. The goal is just to inflict as much damage as possible and to drag this out for as long as possible. I think they accept now that they have no future. If Sudan is going to continue to be an independent sovereign state with territorial sovereignty, with territorial integrity, they have no future in that Sudan. So their goal, I guess, is to take as many people as they can with them at this point. And it's just very unfortunate for Sudan because they have the capacity to take a lot of people, and they are.
Well, I am seeing that they're currently having a siege of the capital of North Sudan, right? El Fasher. And I think other than that, not North Sudan, North Darfur. And aside from that, they control most of North Darfur. So is there maybe, if they can't take all of Sudan, is there any chance they're trying to carve out for themselves an area that they can control that maybe they can receive some sort of unofficial partial sovereignty over in a peace deal or something like that? Like, are we looking at another South Sudan type situation that they might be aiming for?
I really hope not. I really, really hope not, for the sake of the people that live there, because these people have been through so many horrors already over the past 30 years, and they're going through it all over again. If their land was to essentially be handed over to this group of lunatics, it's fair to say that it will be as good as signing the death warrants because these people are going to exterminate them. So I really hope that's not
Yeah, the
that's not what
RSF is the one that's responsible for the original, back when they were
Yes.
the Janjaweed, the original Darfur genocide. So I think this is something that I think is talked about less, but I think should be talked about, is the implications for the people on the ground, not the soldiers, but the actual people on the ground. I think you've pointed out that these RSF fighters are a lot more battle hardened. Some of these fighters actually come from other conflicts like Libya, and they've fought a lot more of these battles than the SAF itself has.
Mhm.
And so while the SAF hasn't become as battle hardened as they do have a lot more modern technology from what I understand. So what this translates into is, instead of fighting these RSF fighters on the ground, they're just indiscriminately carpet bombing overhead, while on the ground you have the RSF just
Absolutely.
brutally, genociding and cutting people up and stuff like that. So I'm going to let you kind of explore that a little bit more in detail, because I think this is kind of a really horrific situation for people on the ground, kind of getting it from both ends, and why, like, it's even in Sudan, a lot of it's really hard for either side to really solidify any support behind them.
So, which is why I agreed with what you said at the start, that both the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF cannot, under any circumstances, be characterized as the good guys. Because if you think about it, the RSF exists because of the Sudanese government. The Sudanese government created the RSF. And the Sudanese armed forces were very, very well aware of the things that then Janjaweed militia were doing, and they gave them cover. They protected them. They didn't just turn a blind eye, they actively protected them. The only reason there's a war going on now is because their interests happen to be in conflict now. But they They had no problems with the things that the RSF was doing in the Omar al-Bashir years. So even though you would have to say, from the point of view of stabilizing the country, having the Sudanese armed forces win this conflict decisively will be like the least worst option. I think it's also fair to say that Sudan itself as a country has not at all passed the basic test of nationhood. Sudan is a country which, as I said earlier, is suffering from a supreme identity crisis. Its population does not know what it is. And that's the source of all of these issues. That's where they all boil down to. That's how come every conflict spirals into an ethnic genocide or a religious genocide, because the entire country is out of its mind. You have people that look like me who insist that they're not African. You have, it's a real mess. There's a whole, I think it's also important to mention that Sudan has basically been colonized twice. So it was first colonized by Arabs from the Middle East, and then it was colonized by the British. So it's Sudanese people in general, I think, have. I mean, I've met Sudanese people who have sort of, you know, got themselves out of the matrix, one in some way, shape, or form, but they are very much the minority. The vast majority of Sudan is just stuck in this mental situation where there's going to be conflict. Even if this particular conflict ends tomorrow, there's going to be conflict for the next few decades. It's almost guaranteed. So, Sudan, as a matter of national urgency, needs to come to terms with its history, needs to decide what it is, who Sudanese people are. They need, as a country, it needs to decide whether Sudan is a multi-ethnic secular country in the manner of maybe Nigeria, because that's a country that's like evenly split between Christian and Muslim with lots of ethnic diversity. But generally, there's still the idea that no matter how much you hate each other, you're all Nigerians and you're never going to be anything but that. And everyone is kind of, generally speaking, okay with it. Sudan needs to get to that point in national consciousness and decide what it is. Because currently, I think there are a bunch of people in Sudan who have this very unfortunate idea that being Sudanese means being Arab or means being Muslim. So if you're not either of those things, then you cannot be Sudanese. As long as that mindset exists, Sudan is never going to have any kind of stability whatsoever. So the central government in Khartoum needs to understand that this is an issue of this is a national priority. The wiring of the Sudanese mind needs to be prioritized as a real problem, because that's where these issues stem from before any foreign geopolitical actor is able to jump in and take advantage of it and magnify whatever is on the ground. So, to be honest, I'm not very optimistic about the near to medium term future of Sudan. I'm just not. I don't see that even when this conflict ends, I say when, if this conflict ends, that necessarily anything is going to change, because I remember when the Darfur genocide ended, it never really ended, but when it ended, that's what we thought as well. Hey, we're moving into a new future. Everything's going to be great. We're all fine and dandy. And then we discovered that even in South Sudan, which is the new independent country created, they started a whole civil war there too over the same issues. So there's something very, very wrong, and I think they need to acknowledge it. Probably, I don't know if they see a Nigerian guy saying it, maybe it's going to come across as an attack. I hope they don't see it that way, but it's in my interest for them to sort this out as well. Sudan is two borders away from Nigeria. The more instability there is there, the more my people are going to die, basically. So it's in everybody's interest for them to sort themselves out.
Well, let me add a Jewish guy attacking, because that they'll enjoy very much too, I'm sure. But I come from a country that knows something about being an ethno state, putting your ethnicity in the center of who you are. And then if you're not part of that ethnicity, you can't be part of the country, right? And we even have something similar to what you're talking about with the Arabs, people who look like you saying that they're more Arab than Arabs. In Israel, they have Jews who look like me, Ashkenazi Jews, but we also have Mizrahi Jews, and Mizrahi Jews look like Arabs. When they came to Israel, they also talked Arabic because they're Arabs, they're Arab Jews. And when they came to Israel, it was very important to them to prove that they were more Jewish than the Jews and more Zionist than the Ashkenazi Jews. And they very often vote to the right of Ashkenazi Jews and keep warning. We know what these Muslims and Arabs are really like, and we need to fight them. And you Ashkenazis, you're clueless. You don't understand what the Arabs are like. You want to act more Zionist than the Ashkenazis who were Zionist earlier than they were, and it leads to all these sorts of things. When you have an ethno-state, it's very important to prove that you're part of the
dominant group
that's represented, the supreme superior group, right? If you're an ethno-state, it means by definition that you believe that in the state, your ethnicity has to be supreme. And most likely you believe that ethnically that group is supreme too, right? You believe that you're superior. Not in all cases, but very often. And that leads to this. And yes, it's identity that drives us. We don't even have resources in Israel. We have high tech now. All we had was oranges at the beginning, but the ethnic identity drove it. And I think that Sudan would need to move away from being an ethno state in order to take away, just like what you said.
Move to be more humanist.
Yeah, it needs to be more like us. The solution is to be more like us. No, so regarding the government in Sudan, they made a big deal in Western media and about how the new government when it took over was more democratic, was less ethnically motivated. How does this government address that element of Arab identity versus African identity? Are they victims of this mindset that you described so eloquently, or are they promoting that mindset intentionally?
I wouldn't. So I wouldn't describe them as victims at all because they were all protagonists in everything that happened. What I actually find most objectionable about them is that now that it's blown up in everybody's face, from the government's point of view, there is this attempt to act like their hands were not involved in any of this. These RSF monsters just sort of came out from under the bed. What could have possibly happened to have led to all this? And it's like, no, you did this. You're looking in the mirror. This is what you did. So I see that there's this uh, distinctly dishonest approach to analyzing this thing historically, and there's this refusal to accept that there is a fundamental problem that needs to be solved. There seems to be this idea, based on the people I've interacted with who are from Sudan, there seems to be this idea that once they can end this war, then Sudan is going to be fine. I don't think Sudan is going to be fine at all. I think there's going to be another war. And after that, there'll be another war. I think this is going to keep happening because there's a fundamental issue that Sudan as a society, this is not just the Sudanese government. Sudanese government is obviously the spearhead of this, but Sudan as a society is not ready to deal with. And I know this because I have dealt with a number of Sudanese people. This is not to say that Sudanese people are all a bunch of like ethno supremacists. That's not what I'm saying at all. However, if you live in, like, say before this war began, you lived in Khartoum, fairly modern city, you had a, middle class lifestyle, very, you had kind of a nice life. Maybe you didn't have to pay attention to the fact that there's these awful stories coming out of West Darfur or the southern part of the country. Maybe just, I used to have a load of friends who fit into that description. They would discuss Syria with you. They would discuss Venezuela. They would discuss it. They would discuss anything except Sudan. And when you bring it up, they get super defensive. No, you don't really understand it. It's just the way it's being reported in media. It's not that bad. But I know that, I'm a researcher and I see these things. Like, I might not have been there, but these pictures are not lying, right? These kids who are being orphaned, these women who are being raped in industrial quantities, these things are happening, but it's like, well, I am part of the privileged class. I'm an Arab Muslim. I'm not an extremist. I'm a moderate, right? So I definitely don't condone those things that may be happening over there, but that's not really my fault, and I don't see why I don't see why we have to focus on that, right? There's so much, right going on in Sudan, right? This is my tiny little corner of the capital city. Hey, look at this new football stadium. Look at this new factory, this gleaming new,
Man, the
these were the kind of
rhymes.
these were the interactions that I had with these people loads of times. So it seems like in polite educated middle class Sudanese society, there's this very deep sense of denial. This very deep refusal to acknowledge that the country is basically built on a crime. Just total refusal to accept it. So
I love this, man, because it really proves my point that we're all the same. It really does.
I mean, the
We're all
liberal
the
elite
same.
bubble that you're describing in Khartoum is identical to the liberal elite bubble we have in Israel and Tel Aviv, and identical to the liberal elite bubble we have in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and New York. You know,
People are all the same, man.
it's really comforting in a way that we're all the same. It's also terrifying because we're all so horrific. And, the liberals are the people who, and I really used to consider myself a liberal. I was, just a few months ago, really, I'm going through something of an awakening. Liberals are the people who make all this possible. They make all this possible. They make you feel comfortable. They create narratives that make everything seem sensible and that you can live with what's happening. And they also create this illusion that things can change without changing their comfortable lives, right?
exactly.
And that's really dangerous.
Let's make sure we don't forget. I know we're kind of coming up. You said you had only about an hour, I think an hour and a half to go. I really want to make sure that we don't forget. What do you think would be some of the greatest people dealing with Sudan currently? And I don't mean warriors. I mean aid people. I mean people bringing in food. I mean something like that skateboard thing that we talked about earlier. Who's trying to make the pain less? Who's showing, that even though people are, because like I said, people are all the same. We have the people who are really sadistic in the world, but there are people always trying to make sure that, the cholera drugs get into the area, the food gets into the area. So, what's going on in that sense? Who would you say would be some of the organizations that need to be highlighted through this conflict?
Okay,
Who are
so
the good guys?
first of all, I'm not speaking for Sudan. I'm just speaking on the people that I know. So anyone who's watching this should feel free to use Google. I'm sure you'll find loads more people. So I know a guy. His name is Ahmed Kabalo. So he was the CEO of a platform called African String, which you may or may not have heard of. He's
Actually did see
actually
that video that you had with
yeah,
him. But
yeah.
go ahead.
So he's actually from Sudan. He's Sudanese, and he's part of this aid network. So what they do, which I find interesting, is that they are not part of the sort of wider narrative that hey, we're trying to raise $5 million for this. They kind of do smaller, targeted things. So we're trying to raise $3,000 to drill a well in this place, and it's very
Well, I
targeted,
love that.
very impactful. All right, so he's like knee deep in that. There's actually a small Sudanese community. So he lives in Nairobi, Kenya. There's a small Sudanese community around him there, which sort of spearheads the fundraising efforts. I try to pitch in whatever little that I can as well. But that's who I know. And that's just one person. They're obviously much
Yeah,
bigger.
send me a link. I'll put it in the
Yeah,
I'll put
we're
it in
going to
the description.
provide links to give. So please give.
Give me that link because especially when it's direct action like that, and it's the type of it's not a band-aid. It's an actual solution. It's not here's some life straws. No, we're gonna dig you a well. I love that. Yeah, less temporary solutions if that
Yes.
makes sense.
Speaking of that, right now there's a strong sense in the humanitarian community that however insufficient funds and resources were a year or two ago, everything's much worse now. There's fatigue of giving. There's the Trump administration that seems to be having some kind of war on aid in general. There's so many crises in the world with Ukraine and Gaza taking most of the headlines. Has the situation humanitarian wise gotten worse? What can be done to make the situation better?
It definitely has gotten worse. And I wish I could give you an answer to the second question. I wish there was a nice little bow I could tie on this conversation. Unfortunately, there just isn't. So if you compare the two, I guess the two major conflicts in the region right now, Sudan and Palestine, if you're comparing them, I actually think there's probably more upside for Palestine than there is for Sudan. I just don't. see much upside. Unfortunately, it's not a pleasant thing to say, but I don't see where the hope is coming from. Primarily because, as you mentioned, the aid pipeline is basically completely dried up, and most people aren't even aware that this conflict exists or is important in any way.
And we should
Secondly,
stress
and I think
the
more,
worst humanitarian crisis in the world by far. Do you agree?
yeah, yeah, yeah. But secondly, and more fundamentally, the other thing that this war has done is that in addition to destroying infrastructure and destroying the actual things that people use to live a normal life, it has also fundamentally disrupted time cycles a lot. So, for example, agriculture. There's basically no agriculture going on in Sudan right now. So, where you have a country of how many million people is the population? Sudan is 50 million people. So we have a country of 50 million people where there's no meaningful agriculture going on for like 2 years now. Even if the war were to end tomorrow, and even if the full mechanized agriculture infrastructure that it had before the war were to magically snap back into place, which it won't, you would still be talking about 5, 6 months before things return to normal. With this level of destruction, you are going to be talking 5, 6 years at least. So to be honest, as I said, I don't see much upside. The entire way of life of the country has been fundamentally disrupted. I can't overestimate just how badly it's been disrupted. The the rural areas, which is where the bulk of the agriculture goes on, unfortunately, those are the areas that are the least secure because everybody, who wants to be safe needs to be in a city that is controlled by the SAF right now. So you want to be in Khartoum, you want to be in Omdurman, but nobody's farming in Khartoum. Nobody's farming it. Those are dry, Saharan cities. So even before the war, the kind of effort that it took to even have irrigated agriculture in a country which is like 75% Sahara deserts, it was a lot. Now it's beyond the pale. So when you read those stories about people like eating wild leaves, those things are true because that's really how bad it is. In an ideal world, I'd have said the responsibility would ultimately lie on the African Union. However, the African Union itself doesn't fund its own budget. So that's not going to happen. So I actually think if there's going to be in the short term, if there's going to be any relief, any large scale help that would actually fix things in the short term in terms of aid, I think it's actually more likely to come from the Arab world. So if the likes of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, for whatever reason, can decide that it's no longer in their geopolitical interests to basically keep this country in the state of turmoil that it is, I think this situation could turn very quickly. I think those are the only actors with the capacity in the region to change things at short notice. The aid industry doesn't have that capacity anymore. The African Union definitely doesn't have the capacity. So, yeah.
Do you think the US could be doing more to stop this, and what could they do? Should they be putting pressure on the UAE? Should they be putting pressure on Qatar? Should they be putting pressure on the government in Sudan? Or would they not be able to do much either?
I think the best thing the US could do would be just to stay out of it altogether because it seems like wherever the US intervenes, it just leads to an even bigger problem. So I think the US is doing the best thing right now, which is staying out of it, to be honest.
I mean, like as you said before with the South Sudan thing, it's like they've done a lot already
Yeah,
to
and they
help fuel it.
created this whole independent country, which is itself engulfed in a new set of conflicts. So you didn't end a war; you started two new ones, basically. So I don't see how that has helped anybody. And in addition to starting a new war, you've put all the oil resources in that new country, and you've given it the capacity to fund forever war. Who has that helped? So here we are.
But would it have been better if they hadn't created South Sudan, or would it basically be the same? My sense is that it would just be a somewhat different array of atrocities created by a somewhat different array of actors on a somewhat different timeline.
So I'll be honest in answering this question. I still think South Sudan is probably better off as it is now, as against to what it was going through prior to the referendum. I still think it's better off now. However, knowing that the entire motive behind splitting it off wasn't really to save people's lives. It was something that someone wrote on a piece of paper in a boardroom in a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. That's where the real decision was made. That's where the real power lies. I feel some type of way about that. As an African,
Fair enough.
to be honest, I will always have some sympathy for South Sudan because we all grew up hearing about the atrocities that they were going through and feeling so helpless and unable to do anything about it. So when they finally got their independent country, like we were so happy for them. So even though obviously now we know that these things didn't happen for the right reasons, but I mean you'd have to say in 2011, Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan, in 2011 didn't have a single multi-lane highway, didn't have an airport. It was basically just a desolate spit of land. And now if you look at it, they've got four-star hotels. They've got an airport. They've got expressways. They've got all kinds of nice things, right? They could be doing a lot better, but compared to where they were in 2011, it's like night and day. So, I mean, I really wish they would find a way to stop fighting because it seems so incredibly stupid to me. But you would have to say, on the balance of things, they're definitely better off now compared to where they were 15 years
So
ago.
that leads me to some thoughts on how to solve this. What if you took for granted the fact that people are pretty terrible and you came up with some way that the UAE and the RSF warlords could enjoy their gold money and give them some quasi-autonomy in those areas, let them enjoy their corrupt lifestyles, and let also build hotels and highways in the areas that they control? It might be better than trying desperately to centralize the country underneath the Sudanese, who would probably treat it badly even if they took over. I know it's rewarding evil, but that's kind of what happened in South Sudan too, right? So, maybe that would take away the motivation that the UAE have and these warlords have to continue the war. I mean, what do you think?
See, this is why I said this is a story which is extremely complicated and has so many moving parts. Because that's one way of looking at it. But what I can guarantee would happen if you did that is that the issue wouldn't end because the sort of quasi country you'd have carved out for those people, they wouldn't be satisfied with it. They'd want to expand and they'd have a base for expansion. And you'd have essentially gifted them the capacity to wage everlasting war on you and they will use it, right? The UAE is very much. I'm not sure if you're aware of the expansionist tendencies of the UAE in Africa, and I don't mean just in terms of using its military or its military capacity, even in terms of buying land, under the guise of carbon credits and all this. The UAE has huge ambitions for becoming a colonial power in Africa. It does. So if you were to give the UAE a de facto unsinkable aircraft carrier on the African continent, that would be a very big mistake. Even though that might seem like a pragmatic thing to do, everyone is fighting, so just let everyone have a little bit of something so they can shut up. But that wouldn't happen. And then in addition to giving them the impetus to wage war on you forever, what that would also do is that they would create encouragement for other groups elsewhere in the Sahel and the Sahara who are trying to do similar things to say, hey, if these guys could do this and get their own pseudo nation or whatever, then if I'm some militant in Mali and I call myself Azawad Liberation Front or whatever, why can't I carve my little republic out of Malian territory? And the only restriction on me getting that is me getting support from the UAE or Saudi Arabia or whatever to fund me with weapons or whatever. And if I kill enough people and if I
And
cause
enough
enough
resources.
damage, then yeah, then I'll basically get a country. Why not? So again, once you create that encouragement for people, you give them a finger, they're gonna take the arm, the elbow, the shoulder as well. So, in as much as it might seem like a pragmatic thing to do, it just wouldn't work and it would backfire so badly. Which is why I said, as far as this Sudan crisis goes, I don't see any quick fix. I don't see any nice bow tied on the story. And I suspect when we end this conversation, you're not going to come out of this conversation feeling happy at
I
all
didn't expect
because
to be fair. No,
yeah,
but wait, I have another terrible idea. What if we took the opposite approach of what I suggested before and labeled the RSF as a sort of ISIS, as a sort of threat to mankind, right? And then tried to raise some sort of international coalition in order to crush them. Now, that would require framing that I dislike on an ideological level of good versus bad, which, as we all agreed here, doesn't really fit in this conflict, right? Well, we're all aware of Sudan's past. We're also aware of the atrocities that Sudan is committing right now, which we haven't discussed enough, and maybe we should talk about in a second. But nonetheless, the world responds to these good versus bad narratives, right? And it's easy to paint the RSF as the bad guys. In fact, it's probably easier than it is in most cases. It's probably easier than it is with the Israelis. It's probably easier than maybe it even is with the Russians. I mean, these guys are really the worst, right? And then get that international support for an operation. Of course, from your perspective, you might object to that because, correctly, there's the issues of colonialism if there's massive international involvement. But it does go along with the agenda that you mentioned before of trying to get the RSF out. So what do you think are the upsides and downsides of that?
Well, it would depend on who the constituent members of this international coalition would be. So if you're talking about the so-called coalition of the willing, then I think Sudan is better off as it is because those guys will only make it worse. Once you have US, UK, Germany, NATO putting boots on your soil. I mean, we saw what happened in Libya. This really wasn't that long ago. I was one of the, if you like, useful idiots who was cheerleading for the thing at the time because
Me too.
I didn't know my metaphorical arse from my elbow at the time, and I thought, hey, a
Was a
dictator
Russian puppet.
a dictator is being taken down, what's not to like? And they didn't just end a dictatorial regime. They basically ended a country because Libya doesn't exist in any meaningful sense any longer. The entire country is basically a memory now. Like Libya is a grammatical expression that we use to describe a place that an area of North Africa. It doesn't actually exist anymore. I don't think if that's the type of coalition we're talking about, that's a useful option. However, if it were to be an African-led coalition, which I guess it's happened before. It's not happened in North Africa. It's happened in West Africa, but it hasn't happened in that region before. But if something similar were to happen in North Africa, that its neighboring countries especially were to raise a military force and basically come together and smash this thing, that would really be the only hope.
What about an economic deal? Instead of all these military ideas, what about an economic deal with the UAE? It's got to be cheaper to buy the gold than to fund a war and then buy the gold at the same time.
Well, for them, it's not.
You
It's
know?
not for the
Well, I
UAE.
know
It's
that
not.
there's a lot of it's power. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong. I do get that. But I'm saying that, like, in my opinion, that would be a lot more likely to gain some kind of steam. But I do get that it is a lot more about power and in a large part, the battle over the Red Sea
yeah,
when it
exactly.
comes to Saudi Arabia and them.
So across the Gulf in general, money's not really it's not really the problem. They don't need your money. They have all the money. So what they're after is territory and influence and power. So there's no amount of money they're gonna offer the Emiratis, I don't think, because like these guys are trillionaires. What the hell do they need your $2 billion for? So I don't think that's gonna do much. But using the parallel of the Liberian Civil War, which took place in the 90s. It was a kind of, well, it wasn't a similar situation, but the closest parallel I can draw is that there was a civil conflict. It was very deadly, very destructive. People were dying in massive numbers. It was just a mess. And what ended up happening was that ECOWAS, which is the regional body for West Africa, raised a military force, which is known as ECOMAG. That's short. So it's basically Nigeria, Ghana, and a few others cobbled together like 20,000, was it 30,000 men? And tanks and ships and all of that stuff. And they went to Liberia, and I'm not gonna lie and say they did this heroic thing because they basically committed war crimes, and they killed probably at least as many Liberian civilians as they did fighters. But eventually, that was kind of what ended the war. They basically came in and carpet bombed the entire country into submission, and then left behind a whole bunch of children, the soldiers, if you get what I mean. So it's not. It's not a. It was very messy. It wasn't a. It's not a story of heroism, but it ended a civil war that could have been a lot more regionally disruptive than it ended up being. So if Sudan's North African neighbors can find a way to do something without being as destructive as the Nigerians were in Liberia, which I doubt, then I guess that's the only version of this story where this ends in, with any kind of meaningful resolution. Otherwise, this to me looks like a forever war. This looks like a war that you're going to come back in 5 years' time, and in some way, shape, or form, it's still going to be raging.
Yeah, they'll call it something else. They'll call it
Yeah,
something else, but it'll keep going. Like Congo, right? Congo, since the
yeah,
90s,
exactly.
they have all these different names for it, different
Mm.
groups, but it's the same war. It comes from the same failure, it comes from the same identity crisis. And that's what really needs to be resolved. So let me ask you this. Are there actors on the ground in Sudan that are trying to challenge or change that identity narrative that's so destructive for Sudan?
I don't know about on the ground because I don't know that anyone who has that level of intellectual capacity feels safe to be in Sudan right now. But I definitely know some Sudanese outside of Sudan who. So I mentioned Ahmed, for example. Ahmed is definitely one such person. So in fact, he's probably the first Sudanese person that I met who seemed to have no mental fog whatsoever as who and what he is. So for reference, Ahmed is Muslim and he speaks Arabic, but he also understands very, very clearly that he's African. He's the first Sudanese person I've met who, when you ask them where you from, or there wasn't that 2 seconds of loading time because that's an experience I've become very accustomed to where you meet a guy that looks like you and maybe he looks like he's from Nigeria and you mistakenly speak a Nigerian language to him or something and then he looks at you and there's this whole and he says something in Arabic and you like he says it like like a human being talking to a stray cat or something. That's an experience I've had so many times. It's like please don't think that just because I look similar to you means that no, I am this and you are that. Ahmed does not suffer from that identity crisis at all. And he, I think, in addition to founding African Stream, and he does a lot of things within the Sudanese diaspora community that I think are invaluable. It was through him that I met the other Sudanese people that I know who seem to have that same ideological clarity. Apparently, there is a community of them. They exist. They're not many, but they exist. So I think this is a terrible thing to say, but I'm just going to come out and say it. I think this war actually provides, or the resolution of this war, whenever that may be, will provide an opportunity for people like that to actually go to Sudan and actually become the ones in charge. And when that happens, I think that's when Sudan will start to finally sort of solve these internal contradictions. When people who actually understand how the world works and their place in it start to occupy positions of power in Sudan. So in a way, in every crisis there's an opportunity because everyone the conventional power structures are being destroyed now because everybody's dying. So which is why I say it's a terrible thing to say, but
Well, you can't kill an idea. You have to change the idea. And that's really what it is, that's kind of why, I know it sounds, overly poetic and naive, but it is really that you need a humanistic, you know, well, it really doesn't matter whether you're Arab or African. At the end of the day, we're all humans and part of this country, and we need to work together and get moving forward. And while, like I said, it's a very American way of looking at things, and it's how you solve multi-ethnic groups living together and coexisting, though. It is the only example of that happening, and it's kind of the only way that I've ever seen to do it is to kind of go forward with, no, you can be black, you can be Asian, you can be white, but at the end of the day, we're all human and we're all working towards a common goal, and we're all American, at least in America. So I think there is something to that kind of mentality that I think is very applicable to large portions of the world, like Israel, Palestine, like,
Of course, the
Sudan
irony is
here.
America's losing that while the rest of the world is moving away from that. It almost seems like an antiquated idea whose time has ended, not because it's bad, but just because it doesn't seem to be the zeitgeist. It doesn't seem to be what anyone wants. I mean, in
Yeah, it's
America,
almost like we're moving back into the 20s again with the big nationalism
this
movements
feels like a lot
spreading
like the
across the
30s,
world.
doesn't it? It feels a lot more like the
Maybe
30s
it
and
would be
20s.
more 30s.
We have the feeling
Yeah.
of all these local conflicts that might turn into a global one. We have a
Mm.
feeling that democracy is weaker than it's ever been, like in the 1930s. We have markets closing increasingly with tariffs, like in the 1930s. It's eerily similar, not to mention rise of various kinds of fascism, genocides becoming more prevalent. It really feels like the 30s are repeating themselves,
And
which is
everybody hates Jews again.
and everybody hates Jews again. Well, they never
I couldn't
stopped,
have
but
said
it's
that.
much more popular. It's much more
So
popular. Which is also like the 30s. There was a lot of anti-Semitism before, but in the 30s it was like very cool, you know. So, yeah, it's eerily similar. Now, I guess the good news there is that democracy proved itself as the idea that would ultimately win, but that came through with a lot of military force and imperialism, which is not necessarily good. Yeah. So the idea that sounded the best to me and sounded the best to you probably regarding Sudan again was the African Union taking some action there because that might have a little bit more legitimacy. But let me ask you a couple questions about that. First, what's stopping that on the side of African politics? And second, how would that be treated in Sudan considering their Arab identity element?
It's
So
a good question.
I guess the most important thing stopping it is financing, funding. Um, Something like 85% of the African Union's annual budget comes from outside of Africa, and most of it comes from the EU. So um, there are, even putting this conflict aside, there are basic, what's the word I'm looking for? The basic things, let's just say, that should be in place on the African continent, which aren't in place simply because the funding mechanism at the EU isn't there. So, as you know, war is an incredibly expensive proposition. So, putting together a peacekeeping force or whatever and deploying them to Sudan and keeping there for years, because they will need to be there for a very long time, at least, in my opinion, at least 10 years. Doing all of that is going to cost billions of dollars. The AU simply doesn't have that money. And more importantly, it seems as if the rest of Africa doesn't necessarily see this as a priority. Even, it was funny how you said that generally this conflict isn't thought of in the global psyche as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Even on the African continent, it's also not thought of. So if you were to meet the average African and ask them to name a conflict in Africa, they'll probably mention the DRC first. Meanwhile, what is happening in Sudan is actually a worse crisis than what is happening in Nigeria. There are more people dying. But it seems so far away and so localized. And there's this, even though literally Sudan shares a border with Kenya, right? Kenya, which is like thought of as like the spiritual beating heart of the African continent, has a border with Sudan. And yeah, there's this very huge psychological distance that, oh yeah, it's a North African thing, it's an Arab thing, so they'll sort it out. Meanwhile, it's really not that far. As I said, Sudan is two borders away from Nigeria. It's not that far, but there's this huge psychological distance between the rest of sub-Saharan Africa and anywhere in the Maghreb and North Africa. So that's kind of where I think this disconnect is coming from. Because if this were happening, say, in, God forbid, in Uganda or something, I think there'll be a lot more mobilization taking place on the continent. That even if the AU doesn't have the money, different member states of the AU can put things together. But here it seems like, well, it's a Sudanese problem. The most we can do is maybe send in a political delegation to try to hold peace talks or whatnot. And also, don't forget that this is not the first time that Sudan is having a civil war. Sudan has been embroiled in civil wars for decades. So several individual AU member states and the AU itself have dedicated, I don't know, thousands of man hours to trying to solve Sudanese problems in the past. If you search YouTube, for example, you can find videos of so many African presidents giving remarks about their efforts to mediate in Sudan. There's a very funny video that you might want to check out. It's this Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, and he's talking about how you go to Sudan, and I mean, it's much funnier when he says it because of his accent. And he basically says you see a black man that is blacker than you, and he says he's Arab, and you're looking at him like, you want to see what's so Arab about you, and he says, no, I'm Arab, I'm not African, and he's like, oh, okay. But I was just saying that to give context for how Sudan is perceived in the African political psyche. They're seen as, oh my God, these people again. Oh, please, we don't even want to deal with them right now. So they can keep
Yeah, I
their
mean,
problems.
to what you're getting at, Bashir was like what, the fifth or seventh or sixth in a row in like 30 or so years of like leaders that became leaders from a coup. Yeah, it's just over and over and over. And from what I understand, that was also part of the whole RSF thing because he was
Yeah,
paranoid that the gentleman that was running the R or the SAF might try to overthrow him. So he was hoping to split it between that
yeah,
guy and Hamedi,
yeah,
and
exactly.
then they ended up teaming up and overthrowing him.
Yeah. And then
So
fighting each other afterwards. So
it
nobody really
getting a
has any
little bit of
time
the
for them.
subtext of what you're saying regarding how Africans treat Sudan. It sounds a little bit like there's also an element of racism there. Because think about you're comparing it to Congo, right? You could say exactly the same thing about Congo, those people again. But the main difference between DRC and Sudan is that the Sudanese are see themselves as Arabs, and then it's sort of seen as a separate problem.
Exactly.
It's a Middle Eastern problem. And then you also see the UAE getting so involved, and it makes it seem, okay, this is an Arab problem. Let the Arabs
Exactly.
handle it. There's an element to
Exactly.
that?
Exactly. But which is why I said there's this huge psychological distance because it's not viewed as, one of our own. It's viewed as those people again. And I'll also say this I'm not proud to say, but this is definitely a thing as well that, well, let me not speak for the whole of Africa. Let me speak for Nigeria, where I come from. There's a very popular idea in the Nigerian psyche, especially over the past decade and a half or so, when terror has become a thing in Nigeria for the first time. Maybe prior to 2010, we had never had a terrorist attack in Nigeria before. Now it's almost like an everyday thing. So there's this idea has taken root that this is prime instability in North African or Middle Eastern country is primarily about Islam. So essentially, this is Muslims being the crazy things that they are. So whatever. Why should we get involved? Why should we risk our lives? Why should we spend our money to go fix, a radical Islamist problem? Which is a very damaging idea because even though obviously political Islam does play a role in these things, it's not primarily about Islam. It's primarily about politics and identity and land. And religion just happens to slip into that. But unfortunately, in the Nigerian popular psyche, there's this idea that, religion uber alles. So unfortunately, a lot of the political conversation here doesn't even get that far. Doesn't even get to the point of analyzing it as, power play involving Israel and splitting off the oil resources. All this conversation we've had is like it will go way over the heads of most of my audience back home because what they can see is, oh, it's a bunch of crazy Arab Muslims. Next, so that's kind of like where we are.
It sounds very similar to my country. Yeah, a bunch of crazy Arab Muslims is the way Israelis describe
Or
pretty much the
mine.
entire Middle East. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of that, and maybe it even ties into the fact that a lot of the terrorism that is experienced in sub-Saharan Africa is indeed Muslim-inspired terrorism. Right? I was just looking at DRC, and Islamic State is slaughtering people over there, right? And same thing in Nigeria, and yeah, I mean, I can understand that from a sub-Saharan African perspective, uh, this can lead to a clash of civilizations style perspective that's so familiar to us in the West, that so many people in the West
So
have. Yeah.
my first eyes on Africa in general was Somalia. And I know that you have some of the terrorist ideology sweeping through. I think it's called Al Shabaab, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
I know that they also have a lot of issues with recruitment from the terrorist side because of the clan system that goes on throughout Somalia. Is there any kind of clan system situation? I'm asking this from total ignorance when it comes to Sudan. That's what I'm curious. Is there any kind of that clan dynamic that's influencing this Arab versus African situation in Sudan?
I I wouldn't call it a clan dynamic. So the Somalia
Or is that
situation,
more just a Somalia thing?
yeah, it's the Horn of Africa. It's very localized.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
In Sudan, it's more of like a more general ethnic issue. So yes, there are a few sub-ethnic groups, like there are people who say they're Tuaregs, they're Berbers, but generally speaking, everyone tends to sort of like put themselves into this identity, this panoply called Arab.
Group A, Group B.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Arab, African, which again, I guess complicates the problem even further because as I've come to understand over the past few years, even the term Arab is not an ethnic term. Well, it wasn't, initially. It's become that now, but you know, it's apparently not, it's quite a recent phenomenon that the descriptor Arab means a light-skinned person that looks like Mohammed Salah. Apparently that wasn't always the case. Apparently someone with dark skin from northern Niger can be considered to be Arab, because apparently the identity Arab has meant a lot of things over the years. So that just further adds to the complication, because these
Like the
words mean
identity
different things to
Jew.
different people. Yeah, exactly.
You got Ethiopian Jews, you got Arab Jews, you got, you know,
So
man.
let's try and end with some positive
Positive.
thoughts on how we move forward and how we change the narrative in Sudan, which you've identified, I think, very correctly as the main driver of the conflict.
I think that the Sudanese government needs to hold a truth and reconciliation committee of some sort. There needs to be a public reckoning of the things that have been done under state supervision or with state knowledge. This culture of dismissal or denial is not going to be helpful at all, and it's just going to worsen this thing in the long run. I can say this with some measure of authority because I've had so much interaction with Sudan's diaspora community. I used to live in the UK. There's a sizable Sudanese diaspora there. And listening to them talk about Sudan, you would think it's this magical, it's all about this cultural dance or this, oh, look at our weddings, they're so colorful. And it's like, I get it. There definitely are those beautiful things. But there's this undercurrent of darkness which pervades the entire country, and everybody is in denial about it. Right? I don't think that's going to be useful going forward. So I think the Sudanese government needs to see this as a national priority, that they need to come to terms with their past. And when I say the past, I'm not just referring to the past 20 or 30 years. I mean the past 100, 200 years. Things that took place in during Arab colonization, things that took place during British colonization. Like, the entire country needs to come to terms with itself. And then the identity layer of what it means to be Sudanese, I think, needs to be transformed. Currently, the even at, I don't know if you're aware, even the flag of Sudan, it's a very typical Arab flag. So it's got the black, the red, and the green. Right? So the flag of Jordan, UAE, Palestine, Sudan, they look very, very similar, right? And that, in my opinion, kind of furthers that confusion even further. Because yes, there is a part of Sudan, there is a part of the Sudanese population that flag might represent. There is another part of the Sudanese population that flag doesn't really mean much to. So just trying to sort of shoehorn a very, very diverse population into this sort of narrow definition of what your idea of a nation is going to lead to more and more and more wars. So I think Sudan needs to start seeing itself less as uh, I don't want to use the term ethno state. It's that has very, very violent connotations. Sudan needs to broaden its idea of what it means. to be a country. Normally, I wouldn't use Nigeria as a good example because there are very, very, very few things you could use Nigeria as a good example for. But one of the things I think Nigeria has done fairly successfully, not very, but fairly successfully, is that everyone in Nigeria, regardless of how much we absolutely hate ourselves and we really do not like ourselves, right? But regardless of how much we dislike ourselves and we fought a 3 year civil war and 3 million people died, all of those things have happened. And every election times is like a mini civil war. All of that happens, yes. But regardless of that, we know that you are a Nigerian. Regardless of which ethnic group you happen to come from, you still are a Nigerian. And you don't have the right to be more Nigerian than another person, right? So it's almost like every Nigerian has two different identity layers, right? So your ethnic group and you're also Nigerian at the same time. Now, at the identity layer of your ethnicity, you can feel free to fight and hate each other as much as you want. But that doesn't interfere with the material facts of you being a Nigerian. I think we've been able to do that fairly successfully. Sudan, not so much. I think the term Sudanese has been mixed up at various times with the term Muslim or the term Arab, and that has created issues that need to be resolved. So I think maybe Sudanese people need to build out a secondary identity layer where all their religions and ethnicities can be contained. And then the super layer called Sudanese can then encapsulate everything. I don't think they ever consciously made the effort to build a nation after independence. I think they need to start doing that now. And I think that's the only way that they're going to fix this problem in the long term. So again, just to wrap this all up, all problems started with the British. And if you're going to fix those problems, then you're going to have to go back to the very nature of British colonization and basically decolonize in a very real sense.
Decolonize the mind. Yeah, and I've always found that Nigerians treat that ethnic divide with a lot of humor, right? You have the Yoruba and the Igbo, right? And they make jokes about it. Some of them are there's a lot of families are into.
So it's more than just making jokes. Things happen, people die, but at the end of the day, the country's still gonna remain what it is.
But
that's that melting pot that I'm talking about, and you're just kind of in the early stages.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the early stages of the melting pot in the U.S., people were dying.
You
Lynchings
can't melt
happened
without breaking a few eggs. No, but I'm not talking about the politics there because I've never been. Well, actually, it's not true. I have been to Nigeria briefly, but just from my personal interactions with Sudanese and Nigerians, it's very different. Nigerians will make jokes, and the Sudanese will not make jokes.
Exactly. They'll hide.
Very seriously.
They'll hide.
Yeah. They don't make jokes about the other groups. They either don't say a word or they say very nasty things. That's been my experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Nigerians, they're always making jokes about it. They even make jokes about the terrorism in Nigeria. Something about the mindset is different.
A lot of Nigerians that I've met have been very, very like upbeat people in general, though.
And very
just,
educated,
like, very
the ones
friendly, educated, joking around about a lot of stuff. So like I said, I have friends that are Pan-Africanists.
Okay.
But hey, I really enjoyed you coming. We will be going over a lot more wars as well, so it's good to have somebody that's very knowledgeable about Africa, and we'll probably reach back out to you.
Yeah, we'll basically say we're going to call you again because that was really good and really helpful. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime.
Again, thank you for making the time, because like I said, I really think that this Sudan issue is something that's not spoke on enough, and it's not really talked about enough, and it's kind of relegated as like a side issue. We're going to talk about this for 15 minutes while we're talking about this other conflict.
Yeah.
And then we'll get back to the other conflict. And I don't think it's a side story, especially not for the Sudanese people themselves.
Exactly. The #1 humanitarian crisis in the world. And so we're going to talk about this again and again and try to raise attention.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably revisit this same issue in a little while and see if we're getting better, we're getting worse.
Or staying the same for 200 years. Yeah.
All righty.
Okay, thank you so much.